described as the incarnation of pure evil.
19th century law enforcement thought that Holmes's murder spree ended on the day he was executed, May 7th of 1896.
Across a rain-soaked cemetery in Pennsylvania, a grave sealed in concrete waited to answer a question that had haunted generations: whether America's most mythologized killer ever truly died beneath its surface. When scientists finally broke through the cement, the discovery not only resolved a century of speculation, it revealed how thoroughly a simple lie can outlive the man who created it. A grave that should have been silent. When archaeologists stepped onto the muddy grounds of Holy Cross Cemetery in 2017, they knew they were approaching more than a burial site. They were approaching the physical center of a debate that had spiraled far beyond the man who started it. The grave belonged to H. Holmes, executed in 1896, yet whispered about as if he had slipped past death and continued his cons from the shadows. His coffin was rumored to be buried deeper than most, encased in concrete, and protected by precautions that seem more suited to safeguarding a secret than honoring a criminal's final request. As the excavation team worked through layers of soil, they confronted not only the weight of history, but also the stubborn persistence of a story that refused to die. The first breakthrough came when they uncovered a wooden coffin precisely where records indicated the burial should be, although the team noticed immediately that something felt wrong. The wood was intact despite its age, the interior suspiciously empty, and the hollow space amplified the silence among the crew. With daylight fading and their allotted time nearly spent, the archaeologists decided to continue deeper, sensing that whatever truth lay below had been waiting long enough to be uncovered. The man behind the myth. Long before Holmes became a figure warped by sensational headlines, he was Herman Webster Mudgett, a medical student who learned to manipulate bodies and people with equal calculation. His years at the University of Michigan introduced him to anatomy labs that relied on cadavers obtained through questionable means. And he quickly discovered how valuable a corpse could be when paired with a forged insurance claim or an eager creditor. By the time he arrived in Chicago in the late 1880s, he had already cultivated a pattern of deceit built on charm, confidence, and the relentless pursuit of financial gain. People trusted him because he appeared educated, composed, and helpful. Yet nearly every business transaction he touched collapsed into unpaid bills, lawsuits, or vanished merchandise. His transformation into H. Holmes was less an act of reinvention than an extension of habits he had already perfected. The building, later labeled the Murder Castle, emerged from this mixture of ambition and opportunism, although much of what the public believes about it was crafted not by investigators but by competing newspapers hungry for dramatic copy. During the 1895 investigation, Chicago police stated that the structure contained no torture chambers, no acid pits, and no elaborate devices designed for anonymous victims. Yet these factual reports were drowned out by more thrilling articles that claimed intricate killing machines hidden behind secret walls. The gulf between documented evidence and popular belief widened instantly, with readers embracing the version that felt more cinematic and refusing to let go even when officials attempted to correct the record. Holmes did kill people, but he killed them through manipulation and proximity rather than through theatrical machinery. And the truth of his crimes became overshadowed by a narrative that rewarded bold invention over patient accuracy. The machinery of myth-making. As Holmes awaited trial, the world around him became an incubator for stories far larger than anything the evidence supported, fueled by a media climate that prized spectacle above verification. Newspaper publishers in the 1890s were locked in fierce circulation battles, and each outlet sought to outdo its rivals by offering readers accounts more lurid and elaborate than the last. Reporters described labyrinths of hidden corridors, mechanized torture rooms, and industrial-scale killing systems that no investigator ever documented. Yet these descriptions spread rapidly because they satisfied an appetite for narratives that framed Holmes as an architect of engineered horror rather than a manipulator who exploited trust. Once these embellished accounts entered print, they developed a momentum that made them nearly impossible to retract, especially as reprints and reinterpretations circulated across multiple cities. The mythology gained further strength in the 1940s when pulp writers revisited the case and elevated the most exaggerated claims into supposedly authoritative histories. These sensationalized portrayals reached new generations who accepted the embellished version as fact, unaware that the original police reports contradicted nearly every dramatic detail. Television later amplified the fiction by presenting reenactments that favored theatrical architecture and elaborate devices, reinforcing the illusion that Holmes operated a death factory rather than a series of personal betrayals driven by greed. The myth grew because each retelling rewarded embellishment, and the public gravitated toward the image of a genius predator directing a mechanical labyrinth rather than a con artist repeatedly cornered by unpaid debts. By the early 21st century, the legend overshadowed the documented case so thoroughly that the question of Holmes's identity at death began to seem more intriguing than the lives he ended. When whispers resurfaced that he might have escaped execution, they flourished in an environment already conditioned to prefer imagination over record, setting the stage for the investigation that would eventually pierce the concrete above his grave. Cracking open the concrete. When the excavation team resumed work at Holy Cross Cemetery, the empty coffin they had uncovered lingered in their minds as an unsettling contradiction, because it suggested either a clerical misunderstanding or the possibility that the long-running rumors of a body swap contained more substance than anyone expected. Archaeologist Samantha Cox understood that stopping at that moment would allow speculation to harden into certainty, so she directed the crew to probe deeper beneath the decoy coffin, guided by the intuition that the truth of Holmes's burial would not have been left unguarded so easily. As drilling continued, the tools struck an unexpected resistance that felt different from wood or soil, and the sound signaled the presence of something deliberately engineered to last. The second coffin, fully encased in hardened concrete, emerged slowly from the earth, revealing a design consistent with reports from 1896 that Holmes had insisted on unusual protective measures. Breaking into the cement required hours of coordinated effort, with the crew contending against rain, collapsing trench edges, and the pressure of limited daylight. The moment the concrete finally split open revealed an environment shaped by decades of waterlogged isolation, because the sealed chamber had prevented oxygen from reaching the body and created conditions that preserved clothing while allowing soft tissue to deteriorate into an unrecognizable mass. Investigators identified a waistcoat, a coat, and intact boots, observations that aligned precisely with period accounts of Holmes's attire at burial, offering an early indication that they had located the correct remains. The skull, partially exposed during the opening, carried remnants of the distinctive mustache Holmes had worn at the time of execution, although the fragile hair disintegrated the moment air reached it. Despite the difficult conditions, the team recovered teeth, bone, and artifacts sufficient for scientific analysis, positioning the investigation to answer a question that had eluded the public for more than a century: the science that ends a century of claims. Once the remains were transferred for analysis, the investigative lens shifted from excavation to verification, because the scientific process required evidence strong enough to withstand both public scrutiny and the weight of decades of speculation. Physical anthropologists began by examining the skeletal structure, noting that the bones matched the age, ancestry, and stature recorded for Holmes at the time of his execution. These observations did not resolve the case on their own, yet they established a biological framework that aligned with historical documentation rather than contradicting it. Dental experts then evaluated the preserved teeth, identifying gold foil fillings consistent with the type of restorative work available only to individuals of significant means in the late 19th century. More importantly, one surviving molar corresponded precisely with dental conditions described in medical records from Holmes's imprisonment, offering a rare point of continuity between a 19th century examination and a modern forensic assessment. The final stage, DNA testing, relied on protocols designed to eliminate the possibility of bias, because the samples were anonymized before being processed at a laboratory accredited for ancient and degraded genetic material. Analysts independently interpreted the genetic profiles without knowledge of whose remains they were examining, and the resulting data demonstrated a conclusive relationship to Holmes's known descendants. The findings closed the door on theories that he had bribed officials, escaped the gallows, or assumed a new identity in another country. Although the scientific results confirmed who lay within the grave, they also underscored how little evidence supported the broader mythology that had flourished around his story. The myth that outlived the man. Although the forensic results left no ambiguity about the identity of the man buried beneath the concrete, they illuminated a deeper contradiction that had shaped the Holmes narrative for more than a century. The public had not been sustained by uncertainty about his death. They had been sustained by the allure of a story that exceeded the boundaries of documented truth. Holmes did not design mechanical chambers of industrialized cruelty, direct a labyrinth intended for anonymous victims, or vanish into another life after the execution. Yet these fictions proved more durable than the evidence disproving them. The myth expanded because it offered a villain whose supposed brilliance seemed to justify the scale of the legend. Even though the historical record portrayed a man defined by financial desperation, impulsive cruelty, and repeated failures to conceal his schemes. This imbalance between truth and invention became most visible when considering the victims whose names had been overshadowed by tales of architectural horror and speculative body counts. Their suffering, grounded in verifiable events, was gradually eclipsed by stories that prioritized spectacle over accuracy. The cultural fascination with Holmes reflected a preference for narratives that elevate transgression into theater, rather than confront the stark reality of manipulative violence carried out by someone far more ordinary than the myth suggested. By the time the DNA results confirmed his identity, the legend had accumulated such momentum that many people treated the scientific findings as merely another version of the story, rather than its conclusion, revealing how thoroughly the myth had detached from the man who inspired it. Holmes never escaped his grave, yet the story built around him wandered far beyond the boundaries of fact. If this journey made you question how easily legends overwrite truth, stay with us, subscribe, and explore the histories that challenge what we think we know.